In 73 BC, a single gladiator escaped a training school with 70 other slaves. Within 2 years, his army had grown to over 100,000 people. He defeated Roman legions again and again. For 2 years, an empire that ruled most of the known world could not stop a man born into slavery. This is the true story of Spartacus. Spartacus was born in Thrace, a region in what is now Bulgaria, sometime around 103 BC. Little is known about his early life. Ancient sources suggest he may have once served in the Roman army before being enslaved, though historians still debate exactly how he ended up in chains. What is certain is that by 73 BC, Spartacus had been sold to a gladiator school in the city of Capua, south of Rome. There, men were trained to fight and die for the entertainment of Roman crowds. Gladiator schools were among the most brutal institutions in the Roman world. Men were treated as property, stripped of their names and their pasts, trained under constant threat of violence, and given no real future beyond the arena. They ate together, slept in cramped cells together, and trained side by side, knowing that any one of them might be ordered to kill another for the entertainment of a crowd. For Spartacus and the other enslaved fighters at Capua, every day brought the same reality: fight, survive, or die for someone else's amusement. It was in this environment, surrounded by men with nothing left to lose, that Spartacus began planning something no one expected. In 73 BC, Spartacus and around 70 fellow gladiators broke out of the school in Capua. Using kitchen tools and improvised weapons, they overpowered their guards and fled the city before Roman authorities could organize a response. They took refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, the same volcano that would later bury the city of Pompeii in ash. From this defensible high ground, surrounded by steep terrain that made a direct assault difficult, they began to plan their next move. Word of their escape started to spread through the countryside, carried by frightened landowners and curious travelers alike. What happened next surprised everyone, including Rome itself. As news of the escape spread, enslaved people from farms, mines, and households across the region began to abandon their masters and join Spartacus on the mountain. Men, women, and entire families fled to Vesuvius, drawn by the same desperate hope: a chance at freedom. Within months, the small band of escaped gladiators had grown into a force of thousands. Rome, distracted by ongoing wars in Hispania and against King Mithridates in the east, initially underestimated the threat entirely. The first force sent to deal with the uprising was led by a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber, commanding a militia of inexperienced men rather than seasoned legionaries. Glaber's forces surrounded the base of the mountain, expecting to starve the rebels into surrender. Instead, Spartacus's men climbed down the cliff face using ropes made from vines, circled behind the Roman position, and crushed them in a surprise attack. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus did what seemed impossible. His army, which eventually grew to over 100,000 people, defeated multiple Roman forces sent against them, including troops led by both consuls of Rome in a single year, an almost unthinkable humiliation for the Republic. They moved across the Italian peninsula, raiding estates and towns, freeing more enslaved people, and growing stronger with each victory. Spartacus proved to be a skilled and disciplined commander, holding together an army made up of people from dozens of different regions, languages, and backgrounds, including Thracians, Gauls, and Germans. For a brief moment in history, an army built entirely from escaped slaves had Rome on the defensive, something almost no one in the ancient world believed was possible. But the rebellion faced a problem from within. Spartacus and his fellow commanders, including a Gallic former gladiator named Crixus, disagreed on what to do next. Spartacus reportedly wanted to lead the army north, cross the Alps, and allow his followers to disperse to their homelands, far from Roman territory, where pursuit would become difficult and the war could simply end. Others, including Crixus, wanted to stay in Italy and continue raiding its wealth while the rebellion still had momentum. This division split the rebel forces at a critical moment, weakening what had until then been a single, unified threat. Crixus and his forces, roughly 30,000 strong, broke away from the main army and were caught near Mount Garganus by the consul Lucius Gellius. 2/3 of his men were killed in the battle, and Crixus himself died fighting. In response, Spartacus is said to have forced 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight each other to the death, gladiator style, as a funeral tribute to his fallen comrade, a brutal mirror of the very violence that had once been inflicted on him and his men. Spartacus then turned his army against the very generals who had defeated Crixus. He crushed the legions of the consul Lentulus in the Apennine Mountains, then turned and destroyed the forces of Gellius as well, an almost unthinkable double humiliation for Rome's highest military officials in a single campaign. A third Roman force, 10,000 men under the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, was defeated near the city of Mutina shortly after. Rome, humiliated by repeated defeats at the hands of an army of escaped slaves, finally responded with overwhelming force. The Senate placed command of the war in the hands of Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest and most politically ambitious men in Rome. Crassus assembled a massive army of 8 legions, tens of thousands of trained and disciplined soldiers, determined to succeed where every other Roman commander had failed. To restore discipline among his own demoralized troops, Crassus revived an ancient and rarely used punishment: decimation. When a portion of his army fled from an early engagement against the rebels, Crassus divided the cowards into groups of 10 and had one man from each group beaten to death by his own comrades, chosen by lot. It was a brutal and humiliating method of punishment, carried out in front of the entire assembled army. But it was effective. From that point on, Crassus's soldiers feared their own commander more than they feared Spartacus. Spartacus, sensing the shifting tide of the war, retreated south toward the coast, hoping to negotiate passage across the sea to Sicily, where he might find new allies among the island's own history of slave uprisings. He arranged transport with local pirates, but the pirates abandoned the deal, taking payment and leaving without him, stranding his army on the Italian mainland. With Spartacus trapped, Crassus made a bold and costly decision. He ordered his legions to dig a massive trench across the narrow peninsula where the rebels were camped.
Nearly 60 kilometers long, reinforced with a high wall, sealing off the entire force from escape by land. For a time, Spartacus's army was effectively besieged, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Eventually, on a stormy night, the rebels broke through the fortifications and escaped the trap, but at a heavy cost, losing thousands of their own people in the breakout. By early 71 BC, word arrived that the Roman general Pompey was returning from a campaign in Hispania, and that another army under Marcus Licinius Lucullus had landed nearby after defeating King Mithridates in the east. Crassus, eager to claim full credit for ending the war before either rival could arrive, pushed for a final confrontation. Spartacus, now surrounded on multiple sides with no path to retreat, had no choice but to meet the Romans in open battle. According to Plutarch, before the battle began, Spartacus's horse was brought to him, as was customary for a commander preparing to lead his troops. Instead of mounting it, Spartacus drew his sword and killed the animal on the spot, declaring that the enemy had plenty of good horses that would be his if he won, and that if he lost, he would have no need of a horse at all. It was a final defiant gesture from a man who had spent 2 years convincing an army of escaped slaves that they could defeat the most powerful military force in the known world.
In the battle that followed, near the region of Lucania in southern Italy, Spartacus's forces were decisively destroyed. Despite years of victories, the rebels were now outnumbered and outmatched by a fully mobilized Roman army with nowhere left to retreat. Spartacus himself died in the fighting to the very end according to ancient accounts, cutting down 2 Roman officers before he fell, though his body was never identified among the thousands of dead. It was, in its own way, a final act of defiance. Even in death, Rome could not display him as a trophy or proof of their victory. Rome's response to the surviving rebels was meant to send an unmistakable warning to the entire empire. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, the road leading into Rome, their bodies left as a message to anyone who might consider rebellion. The Third Servile War was over.
but the story of a slave who had brought Rome to its knees, who had built an army out of nothing but desperation and the will to be free, would outlive every soldier who fought to crush him. More than 2,000 years later, Spartacus is still remembered, not as a footnote in Roman history, but as a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. His name has inspired rebellions, revolutions, and works of art across centuries, long after the empire that crucified him had crumbled into ruin. If this story moved you, subscribe. We tell true stories from history that most people have never heard.